Homeless single father, trembling with hunger, begs for help, until a quiet millionaire does this. Just before the story starts, wherever you are on your journey, consider this your sign to keep going. The city didn't slow down for men like Michael. It never had. It never would. That was a truth he'd learned the hard way, not through bitterness, not through anger, but through years of watching the world move around him like water around a stone. Quick, indifferent, always going somewhere else. Always going somewhere he wasn't invited. He sat on the edge of a concrete planter on Meridian Avenue, the kind of decorative stone fixture the city had installed to make the block look polished, look wealthy, look like somewhere worth being. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was 35 years old, and the most expensive thing within 20 feet of him was the planter he was using as a seat. His coat, a dark canvas jacket, olive green, fraying at the left cuff, was zipped all the way up against the November wind. His boots were worn at the heel but clean. He kept them clean. That mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived the way he lived. When everything else is gone, you hold on to what you can still control. Ethan was asleep against his chest. 6 years old, small for his age. His face tucked into the hollow of Michael's shoulder with the complete, boneless trust that only children can manage. His little fingers were curled around the collar of Michael's jacket. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. Michael had his left arm wrapped around the boy's back, his large hand spread wide across the narrow space between Ethan's shoulder blades. And he hadn't moved that arm in nearly 40 minutes. It had gone numb somewhere around the elbow. He didn't shift it. He didn't adjust. He let the boy sleep. That was the calculation he made a dozen times a day. His comfort against Ethan's. It wasn't even a decision anymore, it was reflex, it was the most natural thing in the world. The street in front of him was Meridian's Restaurant Row, the kind of block where a single dinner cost more than Michael had earned in the last 2 weeks. Glass facades, warm amber lighting, valets in dark coats. The smell of food drifted out every time a door swung open, and Michael breathed through his mouth when it hit him. His stomach had been empty since yesterday morning. Food was a specific kind of torture when you couldn't have it. His hands were trembling, not from cold. He'd been cold before, colder than this, and his hands had been steady. This was hunger, the deep, mineral kind that starts somewhere behind your ribs and works outward until your fingers shake and your vision develops a faint, persistent shimmer at the edges. He'd eaten half a gas station granola bar around noon, split it with Ethan, who'd gotten the larger half without knowing it. And before that, a cup of broth from the church kitchen on Farwell Street. That had been yesterday evening. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't holding a sign, he wasn't calling out. He was simply sitting, keeping his son warm, running the numbers in his head. There was always a next move. That was the rule. You didn't stop moving, even when you were sitting still. He'd had a job 3 weeks ago. Warehouse work on the east side, physical. Grinding, the kind of labor that aged a man's body faster than his years, but it paid and it was honest, and Michael had shown up every single day without complaint. Then the company lost a contract. 22 men let go on a Thursday afternoon, no severance, a handshake if you were lucky. Michael had been one of them. He'd nodded at the foreman, picked up his jacket from the locker, and walked to the bus stop without a word. Ethan had been at the after-school program. Michael had sat on that bus bench for 30 minutes just breathing, running numbers in his head, calculating how many days the last paycheck would carry them before the real decisions had to be made. It had carried them 2 weeks. He was on the far side of that now. The shelter on Clement Street had space for him and Ethan, but it didn't open family intake until December 1st. 11 days. 11 days that felt like a year from where he was sitting. Other shelters existed, but most didn't take children. And the ones that did came with costs he wasn't willing to pay. He'd slept in the park the last 2 nights. It hadn't broken him. He was harder than that. But each morning, watching Ethan wake up confused and cold, he felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with the weather. He was thinking about the food bank on Pryor Street when the door of the restaurant across the street swung open and the noise arrived. Not a loud noise, just presence. the particular kind of entrance that powerful men make when they're used to being watched. The man who walked out was silver-haired and expensive, the kind of man who fills a sidewalk with his presence before he's even said a word. He had 2 associates with him and the confident ease of someone who had never once been told no by a city. His name was Gerald Harmon. Michael didn't know that yet. What he knew in that moment was the type. He'd seen the type before. Men who moved through spaces as if the space had been built for them specifically, as if every other person present was background detail in their personal story. Harmon's eyes swept the block with the casual survey of a man taking inventory, and they landed on Michael. Stopped there. Stayed there a beat too long. Michael held the look. He didn't look away. That was a rule, one he'd made for himself years ago, long before the streets, back when he was a different kind of man in a different kind of life. You hold your ground with your eyes. You don't give that up. Something in Harmon's expression shifted. Not quite displeasure. Something closer to the irritation of a man who has encountered an object that shouldn't be where it is. He said something to one of his associates. A murmur. A gesture in Michael's direction. The associate crossed the street with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a simple task. He stopped in front of Michael and looked down at him the way you might look at something you'd found stuck to your shoe. Sir. The word was technically polite. The tone was not. This is a private establishment's frontage. You're going to need to move along. Michael looked up at him. He didn't move. I'm not on private property. This is a city planter. The associate blinked, recalibrated. Mr. Harmon would prefer that you... Then Mr. Harmon can come say that himself. The associate returned to Harmon, said something low. Harmon's face did a thing, a small tightening around the jaw, the look of a man who has been told no and hasn't heard that word in quite some time. He crossed the street himself. His companions followed. The small gravity of money and certainty arrived on Michael's sidewalk like a weather front. Harmon looked at Michael for a long moment. At Ethan, still sleeping. Back at Michael. You're making this block uncomfortable, he said. His voice was the kind of voice that had spent decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. Smooth and certain. There are services for people like you. Use them. People like me, Michael repeated. Men in your situation. I'm sitting on a public sidewalk. My son is sleeping. I'm not asking you for anything. A small crowd had begun to form, not dramatically, just the natural aggregation of people who sense friction and slow their pace. 2 women near the restaurant door. A couple waiting for a car. A man in a delivery jacket who'd stopped with his hand truck. Phones were out. Of course they were. Harmon's voice lifted slightly. Not shouting. Performing. I've seen your type camped out here for 3 nights running. This isn't a campground. It isn't a charity. These are businesses that pay taxes that contribute to this city. You, and here the pause was surgical, deliberate, are a blight. The word landed in the cold air and stayed there. Michael felt it the way you feel a slap, the shock before the sting. He felt Ethan shift slightly against his chest. The small body stirring but not waking. He put his hand more firmly against the boy's back, held him still, not because he had nothing to say, but Ethan was against his chest, and that one fact canceled everything else. So he sat. He breathed. He let the word hang there in the air between them, and somewhere in the crowd that had gathered, a woman in a gray coat had stopped walking. Her name was Maya Kessler. She was 28 years old. She hadn't planned to stop, but something on that sidewalk was holding her in place, and she was still trying to understand what it was. It wasn't pity. She'd learned to be careful about pity. It was something else. Something in the way the man on the planter was sitting. Shoulders level, not collapsed, not broken. The way he held his son. The way he wasn't looking at Harmon like a man who had been beaten, but like a man who had decided some things weren't worth his words. She had seen that look before, once, on her father's face. It was the look of a man who had decided that his silence was worth more than their words. And the man on the planter just sat there, still, quiet, holding his boy. His left hand was resting against the child's back. And there, On the inside of his wrist, where the cuff of his jacket had ridden up slightly, was a tattoo. Small, dark. A symbol she recognized with a jolt that surprised her, because she hadn't expected to see it here, on this sidewalk, on this man. A trident. Clean lines, simple. Exactly the kind of mark that certain men carried from certain kinds of service that most people spent their whole lives knowing nothing about. She took a breath. She took a step forward. And across the street, on a cold city sidewalk, the story changed. There are things that don't show up on any record. Not on the work history Michael had typed out on his phone and emailed to 14 different employers in the last 3 weeks. Not on the intake forms at the shelter on Clement Street, which asked about prior addresses and employment gaps and emergency contacts in the flat. Clinical language of systems designed to process people rather than understand them. Not in the face he showed to the world, the clean-shaven, steady-eyed face of a man who knew that the first thing people took from you, before your job, before your home, before your dignity, was their willingness to take you seriously. What didn't show up was the weight. Not the physical weight, though God knew there was that too. The grinding cellular exhaustion of a man who had been sleeping on park benches and eating 1 meal a day, and carrying a 6-year-old on his back across the better part of a city. That was real. That was in his knees and his lower back and the persistent dull ache behind his eyes that no amount of cheap gas station coffee could fully address. But the other weight, the invisible kind, was heavier than all of that combined. It was the weight of remembering what he used to be. He thought about that sometimes in the quiet hours. Not often. He'd trained himself away from it, the way you train yourself away from any habit that costs you more than it gives. But sometimes, usually in the hour before dawn when Ethan was still asleep and the city was at its most honest, the memories came whether he wanted them or not. He had been once a man of a very particular kind of competence. From 22 to 31, he had operated in spaces where failure wasn't measured in lost contracts, but in the absence of living people who should have been present. He had been precise, disciplined, the kind of man the military produces when it takes someone already built for the work and spends years sharpening that into something the civilian world has no name for. He'd left because of Ethan. That was the whole of it. No drama, no breakdown, no injury that made the choice for him. Just the day he'd come home on leave and his sister had placed a 5-month-old boy in his arms and said, "He needs you, Michael. He needs his father, not a uniform." Ethan's mother had been gone by then. Complications. The doctors had said, the word that means everything and nothing. And Michael had looked down at his son's face and felt something in his chest that he'd spent years hardening into something operational, crack completely open. He'd submitted his paperwork within the month. His commanding officer had looked at him across a metal desk and said, without sentiment, "You're one of the best I've ever had, and you're making the right call." That had meant something. It still did. The transition had been harder than he'd expected. He was strong, disciplined, capable of more physical and mental work than most men half his age. He could follow orders and give them. He could think clearly under pressure and remain calm in situations that dissolved other people. Those were real skills. He'd believed they would translate. And they had, for a while. 3 years of solid work, logistics coordination, then a private security contract, then the warehouse job that had paid modestly but reliably. He'd had an apartment on the south side, small but clean, with a second bedroom where Ethan slept surrounded by drawings he'd made at school and a plastic tub of dinosaurs that he arranged in precise configurations and explained to Michael in serious, expert detail each evening before bed. He'd had a life. Then the apartment building sold. The rent tripled in 4 months. Michael had found a cheaper place further out. The warehouse job had ended. The next was harder to find, and the one after that harder still. And somehow, in the quiet accumulation of setbacks that don't make headlines and don't appear in statistics because they happen one family at a time, he had ended up here. On a sidewalk, holding his boy. He was not ashamed of it. That was what would have surprised people. The assumption was that men in his situation were broken, that poverty was evidence of moral deficiency. He'd seen that assumption in 100 eyes since the bottom had dropped out. Each time he felt not shame but a quiet, banked anger. Because he knew who he was. He knew what he had done and what he had given. None of that had been taken from him by a rental market or a lost contract. He had been a good soldier, and he was a good father, and he would find a way through this the same way he had found a way through everything else. He just needed time, and food, and 11 more days. The morning after Harmon had called him a blight, Michael woke in the park before dawn with Ethan curled against him under both their blankets, the boy's small warmth, the only comfort in the cold gray air. He lay still for a few minutes running the day's calculations. Food bank at 7, a job posting he'd found on the library computer. Day labor, not ideal, but cash. Phone needed charging. The library opened at 9. Back before dark, or the shelter on Farwell would sometimes let families wait inside the foyer if you asked quietly and didn't make a fuss. He ran these things through his mind with old precision. And when Ethan stirred and opened his eyes, soft, momentarily confused, Michael smiled at him. "Morning, buddy." "Is it cold?" Ethan asked, which was how he always started mornings now, the question both practical and somehow philosophical. "Little bit. Nothing we can't handle." Ethan considered this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old performing his own internal calibration. Then, "Can we get hot chocolate?" "We're going to the food bank this morning. They might have hot drinks." "Okay." He said it simply, without complaint, in the way that children accept realities they have no frame of comparison for. Michael watched him, and felt that tightening in his chest again, the one that had no name. Exactly. But that sat somewhere between grief and determination, and the fierce, inarticulate love that had rearranged everything in his life, and that he would not have traded for anything the world had ever offered him. They made it to the food bank at 6:58. There were already 11 people in line ahead of them. Michael nodded at a man he recognized from the shelter circuit, mid-40s army jacket, the careful posture of someone who had also once stood straighter, and the man nodded back. No names. Just recognition. The quiet solidarity of men who knew what it cost to be in this line and were standing here anyway. The food bank gave them bread, canned soup, a small carton of apple juice for Ethan, and a bag of rice. They walked to the library together, Ethan narrating a complicated story about a dinosaur rescue mission involving underwater volcanoes and a triceratops named Gerald. Michael laughed at that last part without meaning to. "Gerald?" he said. "He's the bad one," Ethan explained seriously, "but he learns to be good at the end." They reached the library at 9:15. Michael got on a computer while Ethan sat beside him looking at picture books with the focused intensity he brought to everything. And that was when Michael saw the email. It was from an address he didn't recognize. Subject line, "I saw you." He almost didn't open it. He'd gotten enough well-meaning but hollow outreach from people whose compassion had a shelf life. But something about the spare directness of those 3 words made him click. "Mr. You don't know me, my name is Maya Kessler. I was standing across the street from you last night on Meridian Avenue when that man spoke to you the way he did. I want you to know that I watched how you handled that. I watched the way you held your son throughout it. I want to offer you something, not charity, I want to be clear about that. Because I don't think that's what you need or what you'd accept. But I have a proposition, and I'd like to explain it in person if you're willing. I know this is unusual. I understand if you don't respond. But I think you're a man who can read a situation, and I hope this situation reads as what it is. Genuine." Monsieur Kessler Michael read it twice, then a third time. He looked at Ethan, who had found a book about ocean creatures and was holding it up to show Michael a photograph of an anglerfish with an expression of delighted horror. Dad, look at its teeth." "I see it," Michael said. He looked back at the email. He closed the browser, sat back and spent a long moment thinking about the tattoo on his wrist, the one he'd almost forgotten about, the one he hadn't thought about in years, and why a woman he'd never met on a cold city sidewalk might have noticed it. His hands had stopped trembling. He held the phone a moment longer than he needed to. Then he set it face down on the table and looked at the window. He didn't fully understand why. The email sat in his inbox for the rest of the morning. But it didn't leave his mind. Not once. Not for a single moment, through all the hours of walking and calculating and surviving that made up the rest of his day. Something about those 3 words wouldn't let him go. I saw you. When was the last time anyone had? 11 days felt different depending on where you were standing. From the inside of the life Michael was living, the cold, the hunger, the constant arithmetic of survival, 11 days was an eternity. It was the distance between where he was and something that resembled safety, measured not in miles but in the particular cruelty of time that only people in genuine hardship understand. The way a day stretches when you are managing a child's fear and your own and the mechanics of basic existence simultaneously. The way night arrives like a sentence. From the outside, 11 days was nothing. A long weekend plus a week, a brief wait, something you barely noticed passing. He understood both perspectives. That was one of the stranger things about where he'd ended up. The ability to see himself from the outside with the cool, analytical detachment of someone observing a tactical situation, even as he was living it from the inside with every nerve ending he had. It was a skill, of a kind. It had gotten him through things that had broken other men. It also meant he was never fully free of self-awareness, which was sometimes its own particular burden. He had answered Maya's email on the second day. Short, direct. He'd written 4 drafts and deleted 3 of them, each version shorter than the last, each one stripping away the explaining and the justifying and the careful softening that he'd caught himself doing and that he didn't want to do. The 4th draft was 6 sentences. He'd sent it before he could revise it again. She'd responded within an hour. They'd met at a coffee shop on the north end of Meridian, not the restaurant row, further up, where the places were smaller and less performative, and where a man with a 6-year-old and a worn jacket didn't draw the kind of attention he'd drawn 3 nights before. Maya had been there when he arrived, already at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a hot chocolate that she'd ordered without asking, somehow anticipating what Ethan would want. That had told him something about her. Ethan had accepted the hot chocolate with the precise mixture of shyness and delight that defined most of his interactions with strangers. Sidelong, careful at first, then suddenly fully present when he decided someone was trustworthy. He'd decided about Maya in approximately 4 minutes. Michael clocked that internally. Ethan's instincts were good. Michael trusted them. Maya Kessler was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, serious and open at once, with the alertness that belonged to people who had trained themselves to notice things, simply dressed. No performance to it. She met his eyes and didn't look away when the conversation got difficult, which it did quickly, because she was evidently not a person who wasted time. I own a logistics firm, she'd said. Mid-size, 42 employees. I have a warehouse coordinator position I've been trying to fill for 6 weeks. The last 2 candidates couldn't handle the physical side. I looked at your background. How did you find my background? The tattoo on your wrist, it narrowed things significantly. She'd said it without apology or evasion. I served 4 years military intelligence. I know what that mark means. I know what unit it's associated with. I did some research. He'd sat with that for a moment. That feels like a lot of research for a stranger on a sidewalk. It was, she agreed. I want to be honest with you about that. I can explain my reasoning, or you can tell me to leave you alone and I'll understand. He'd looked at her across the table. He'd looked at Ethan, who had his hands wrapped around the hot chocolate and was watching a pigeon on the sidewalk outside, with the focused interest of a naturalist. He'd looked back at Maya. Explain your reasoning, he'd said. What followed was the most direct conversation he'd had with another adult in longer than he could remember. She told him about the position, about the pay, real money, not day labor money, and about an apartment 2 blocks from her office she could secure against his first month's salary. Clear that it wasn't charity. Clear he'd be working for it. Clear, and this was the part that took a particular kind of courage, that she hadn't done this for a stranger before and wasn't entirely sure why she was doing it now. You don't need to explain that part, he'd said. I think I do, for both our sakes. Then I'm listening. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then, I watched you sit on that sidewalk while that man said what he said to you, and you didn't move. You didn't argue. You held your son and you didn't give that man one single thing he was trying to take from you. She paused. I've been in rooms full of powerful people my entire adult life. I've been talked down to and dismissed and underestimated by people with a lot more polish than Gerald Harmon. And I have never, not once, handled it with the kind of dignity I saw on that sidewalk. Another pause. I wanted to know who you were. He'd been quiet for a long time after that. Then Ethan had turned from the window and said, with absolute seriousness, "The pigeon found a whole piece of bread." Maya had laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and something in the space between them had shifted. That had been 5 days ago. He was working now. Not at her company yet. That started Monday when the paperwork cleared. But she'd connected him with a colleague who needed short-term help with physical inventory. Cash daily, which had been enough to carry them through. The apartment was available on the 1st. 9 more days that felt somehow different from the 11 they'd been. He was standing outside the building where Maya's office was. His route back from the inventory job took him past it, and he'd found himself slowing here without quite deciding to, when the car pulled up to the curb in front of him. Not Maya's car, a black SUV, tinted windows, the particular model that said money spent on discretion rather than display. It stopped. The window went down. Gerald Harmon was in the back seat. Michael looked at him. Harmon looked at Michael. The moment stretched. "Well," Harmon said. His voice had that same boardroom smoothness. "Looks like you found a benefactor." Michael said nothing. Maya Kessler. Harmon said her name with the familiar ease of a man who knew everyone of consequence. "She's a smart girl. Good instincts. Bad judgment occasionally." He looked at Michael with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. "I know the company she's building. I know the contracts she's been going after. I have relationships with the people who award those contracts." Still Michael said nothing. "I'm going to offer you something," Harmon said. "Walk away from whatever arrangement you have with her. Quietly. No drama. I'll make sure you land somewhere with a salary and a reference and no difficulty." "That's a generous offer, all things considered." Michael looked at him for a long moment. He thought about a sidewalk a few nights ago and a sleeping boy against his chest and a word, blight, hanging in the cold air. "No," he said. Simple as that. One word. Without decoration, without anger, without anything the other man could use. Harmon's expression shifted. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." "I understand exactly who I'm dealing with," Michael said. "I've been dealing with men like you my whole life. You just usually have better titles." The window went up. The SUV pulled away. Michael stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the cold air moving around him, his hands entirely still at his sides. Then he took out his phone and typed a message to Maya. "Harmon just approached me. Offered me money to walk away from the arrangement. I said no. You should know." The reply came in under a minute. "I know. He called my office 20 minutes ago. Same offer to me." Then, after a brief pause, "I said no too." Michael looked at the message for a long moment. He was still standing on the sidewalk when he heard small footsteps behind him and turned to find Ethan trotting toward him from the corner, his little backpack bouncing, his face breaking open into the completely unguarded, full-body joy that children have when they see the person they love most in the world. "Dad!" Michael caught him, lifted him, held him up in the cold air and then pulled him close, and Ethan wrapped his arms around his neck with that same boneless, complete trust he'd had on the sidewalk on Meridian Avenue. And Michael stood there on the street with his son against his chest, and the message on his phone and the feeling, unfamiliar and cautious, but undeniably real, that something was beginning that he didn't yet have words for. He didn't need words yet. He just needed to keep standing. 9 days, a job starting Monday, an apartment on the 1st, a woman who had said no to Gerald Harmon without hesitating, and somewhere behind all of that, the question that had no simple answer, the question of what it means when two people who have been alone for very different reasons find themselves, against all logic, standing on the same ground. Whatever was coming, Michael had stopped running the numbers. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was simply waiting to see. There's a particular kind of strength that the world never applauds. Not the strength of men who stand on stages or sign contracts or make the kind of decisions that get written about in newspapers. Not the strength of men who are loud about what they've sacrificed or who keep a careful accounting of what the world owes them. The world has always been comfortable celebrating that kind of strength. It has statues for it. It has award ceremonies and keynote speeches and long dinners, where men in expensive suits congratulate each other on the weight they've carried. The strength Michael carried had none of that. It was the strength of a man who woke before his child every morning. Not because he'd slept well, because he almost never slept well anymore, but because he wanted to have his bearings before Ethan opened his eyes. He wanted the first thing his son saw to be a father who was already upright, already present, already facing the day without fear. That was a choice he made every single morning, regardless of how his body felt, regardless of what the night had cost him. He made it without ceremony. He made it without anyone watching. He made it because that was what you did when you were the only thing standing between a 6-year-old and the full unfiltered weight of a world that would not wait for either of them to be ready. Monday came. Michael wore the cleanest shirt he owned, a navy button-down that had been pressed with a travel iron he'd borrowed from the church donation closet and returned the same afternoon. His boots were polished. His jacket was brushed. He had looked at himself in the bathroom mirror at the library that morning. In the single square foot of reflective space available between the paper towel dispenser and the hand dryer, and he had taken a breath and decided that he looked like a man going to work. Not a man coming from where he'd been. A man going somewhere. Ethan had inspected him with great seriousness before they parted ways at the corner near the school. "You look like a businessman," Ethan announced. "Yeah? Like the good kind, not the mean kind." Michael had crouched down to eye level with him, straightened the collar of his son's jacket, and held his gaze for a moment. "I'll be there at 3:15, right at the corner." "I know," Ethan said, with the quiet confidence of a child who had learned, against all the evidence the world had offered, to trust that his father's word was iron. Michael had walked the 12 blocks to Maya's warehouse facility, with his hands in his pockets, and his mind running the kind of calm, pre-operational inventory that had once preceded very different kinds of work. He knew the building. He'd walked past it twice over the weekend just to know it, just to have the geography settled in his mind. The loading bays, the entrance, the parking configuration. Old habits didn't disappear, they just found new applications. Maya had met him at the door herself. She hadn't needed to do that. There was a front desk, a staff coordinator, a perfectly functional process for onboarding a new employee that didn't require the owner of the company to be standing in the entrance at 7:55 in the morning. But she was there, and she greeted him without making a production of it, and she introduced him to the floor manager, a compact, efficient man named Darren who shook Michael's hand with the grip of someone who respected demonstrated competence. And then she had simply stepped back and let him begin. That, too, told him something about her. The work was familiar in its bones, even if the specifics were new. Inventory logistics, load sequencing, coordinating between the receiving dock and the distribution floor. It required the ability to hold multiple moving variables in your head simultaneously and update your model in real time as conditions changed. Michael had spent 9 years doing exactly that in environments considerably less forgiving than a warehouse in November. By noon, Darren had stopped hovering. By 2 o'clock, 2 of the longer-tenured floor staff had started coming to Michael with questions rather than taking them to the front office. He noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. He just answered the questions and kept moving. At 3 o'clock, he told Darren he needed to leave at 3:10 to pick up his son from school. Darren looked at him for a moment, recalibrating Michael could see, updating some prior assumption, and then nodded. 3:10, Darren said. "I'll have the end-of-day report ready for your review in the morning." Michael had nodded and kept working until 3:09, then left at a pace that got him to the school corner at 3:14. 1 minute ahead of when Ethan came out through the double doors and spotted him immediately from across the yard, the way children spot the people they love, not by searching, but by knowing exactly where to look. That evening, in the single room at the extended stay motel that Maya had secured for them until the apartment opened on the 1st, Michael sat on the edge of the bed and listened to Ethan tell him about his day with the same focused attention he gave everything his son said. There had been an incident with a crayon. There had been a dispute about whose turn it was on the balance beam. There had been a new book about the solar system that Ethan had apparently memorized in its entirety during reading hour. Saturn has 83 moons, Ethan informed him, with the gravity of a man delivering important intelligence. 83. At least, they might find more. Good to know, Michael said. Ethan fell asleep mid-sentence about 40 minutes later, one hand flung out toward Michael's side of the bed, as if even in sleep he needed to know his father was close. Michael sat there for a while in the dark, listening to the boy breathe, feeling the particular quality of stillness that came after a day of genuine forward motion, not the desperate stillness of a man trying not to drown, but the quiet of a man who had taken ground and was standing on it. He thought about Maya, not romantically, or not only that, not yet, not in any way he was willing to name. He thought about her the way he thought about things that required careful assessment before action. She was, he was beginning to understand, more complicated than she appeared. Not in a duplicitous way. In the way that people are complicated when they have been alone for a long time and have built something real to show for it, and still somehow feel the lack of something they cannot quite name. He recognized that. He'd been living in that space himself for 3 years. She had been at the warehouse twice that day. Both times she had been there for legitimate operational reasons. Both times she had spoken to him in the same direct, no-performance tone she'd used at the coffee shop, and both times, when she'd moved on to the next thing on her day, he'd found himself watching her go with an attention he didn't fully choose. He didn't act on it. He wasn't a man who acted on things before he understood them. But he noticed. And in the quiet of that motel room, with his son asleep beside him and the sound of the city moving outside the window, he sat with the noticing and let it be what it was, unfamiliar and careful, and underneath all the caution, something that felt for the first time in a very long time, like the beginning of something, rather than the end. Gerald Harmon had not gone quiet. Michael had known he wouldn't. Men like Harmon didn't go quiet. They recalibrated. They applied pressure through different channels. They found the leverage points that weren't immediately visible and worked them with patience. Michael had encountered enough of that kind of thinking, in enough different arenas, to recognize the pattern. The direct approach had failed. That meant an indirect approach was coming. He mentioned it to Maya on the third day. Not as a warning, but as a shared information update. He'll come at the contracts, Michael said. Not at us directly. At the relationships underneath. Maya had looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was hard to read. Something between professional assessment and something more personal. Then she'd said, I know. I've been managing Harmon's interference for 2 years. He wants to acquire my client list more than he wants to buy me out. And since I won't sell either, he tries to make the operating environment difficult enough that I'll change my mind. Has it worked? Not yet, she said. And the way she said those 2 words, flat, factual, with a steadiness underneath them that cost something but didn't show the cost, told him more about who she was than anything else she could have said. He nodded. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He wasn't that kind of man. What he said was, tell me what you need. She had looked at him for a long moment after that. Something moved across her face, something careful and surprised and quickly managed, but there for a moment before it went back behind the professional surface. Then she had turned back to her desk and said in a voice that was only slightly different from her usual one, I'll let you know. That night in the dark of the motel room with Ethan breathing steadily beside him, Michael stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she had looked at him in that moment. The thing that had moved across her face before she put it away. He recognized it, because he'd felt it too. Some things build the way pressure builds underground, slow, invisible, gathering force in the dark until the surface above has no choice but to acknowledge what has been moving beneath it all along. Michael had spent his whole life knowing how to read terrain. He knew when something was coming. He just didn't yet know what to do about it. The night before the apartment became available, Maya asked him a question. They were in her office, late, after the warehouse floor had cleared and Darren had locked up, and Ethan was asleep in the small sitting area off the main office where he'd been doing homework before exhaustion folded him into the couch with his sneakers still on. It was the kind of late evening quiet that settles over working spaces once the workday is officially done, but the thinking hasn't stopped yet. Maya had a logistics problem on her desk, a routing issue with 3 overlapping deliveries, and a client who needed all 3 resolved by Thursday morning. And Michael had stayed because she'd asked him to look at it with her. And they'd solved it in about 40 minutes by splitting the approach in a way that neither of them had seen immediately. But that was obvious once they'd talked through it together. After that, they'd just sat there for a while, in the particular ease that comes between people who have discovered they can think well together. And that was when she asked, "What was it actually like?" she said. "The work. The real work." He looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which he'd come to expect from her. "That's a big question," he said. "I know. You don't have to answer it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds. A truck downshifting somewhere. A distant siren, the low ambient hum of a place that never fully stopped. He looked at his hands. At the tattoo on his wrist that had started all of this, in its way. The small dark mark that had been invisible to 1,000 people on 1,000 sidewalks, and had been seen clearly and immediately by a woman in a gray coat who had served 4 years and knew what she was looking at. "It was the most purposeful I've ever felt," he said finally. "And the most costly. Both of those things at the same time, for 9 years. He paused. "The purposeful part you can talk about. The costly part you mostly can't. Not to people who weren't there." "What kind of costly?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something he hadn't said to anyone since leaving the service, something he'd kept in the sealed-off part of himself, where he put the things that were too heavy for ordinary conversation. "The kind where you do the thing correctly," he said. "And correctly means someone doesn't come home and you spend the rest of your life knowing that you made the right call and living with what the right call cost. Both of those things. Forever. Simultaneously." The office was very quiet. Maya looked at him the way she always looked at difficult things, directly. Without flinching, but with something in her eyes that wasn't the professional assessment she usually showed. Something older, something that knew the particular shape of that weight, even if she hadn't carried the identical version of it. "I lost a colleague," she said quietly. "Not in the field. An accident. 3 weeks before we were both due to rotate out, she was 26. A pause. I've never fully known what to do with that. With the fact that I came home and she didn't, and there was no call to make, no decision, no right or wrong. Just randomness. Just the particular cruelty of something having no meaning at all." Michael nodded. He didn't try to resolve it. He didn't try to draw equivalence or offer comfort that would minimize. He just acknowledged it the way men acknowledge things that deserve acknowledgement, directly, without softening, with the full weight of attention. "That's harder," he said. "In some ways." "Is it? At least mine had a logic I could live inside. Yours has no logic. That's a different kind of thing to carry." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then softly, "How did you end up on that sidewalk, Michael?" "Really? I've read the basics. I want to understand the actual story." So he told her. He told her about the apartment and the developer and the rent. He told her about the warehouse job and the Thursday afternoon, and the 22 men standing in the parking lot with their jackets over their arms. He told her about the calculations, the endlessly running calculations, the math of survival that had replaced the math of operations without ever fully losing its operational character. He told her about the park and the cold mornings and Ethan waking up confused and Michael making himself smile before the boy could register anything other than his father's face. He told her about the church kitchen on Farwell Street and the man who'd handed him soup without asking his name and how that had been, somehow, harder than the hunger, the acceptance of it, the letting go of the pride that told him he should be the one doing the giving. He told her about the 11 days, about how 11 days can be a year or a minute, depending on where you're standing. And then he told her the thing he hadn't told anyone, the thing he'd kept sealed under everything else, under the calculations and the forward motion and the daily performance of a man who was managing. "The night before I ended up on that sidewalk on Meridian," he said, "I sat in the park after Ethan fell asleep and I thought, for maybe 20 minutes, About what it would look like if I couldn't find a way through. What it would look like for him if I failed completely. He stopped. Not in a dark way. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't in that kind of place. But I sat there, and I let myself look at it directly, the way you have to look at any threat directly to actually neutralize it. And what I found, when I looked directly at the worst version of it, was that my fear wasn't for me. It was entirely for him. Every gram of it. And when I realized that, I understood that I wasn't going to stop. Not ever. Not for anything. Because the fear belonged to him and the solution belonged to him, and as long as he was breathing, I had a mission, and a mission doesn't end until it's complete. Maya was very still. Then she said quietly, "You've been running at full capacity alone for 3 years." "Yes." Without anyone seeing it. "Most people don't see it," he said. "That's how it works. The men who carry the most are usually the least visible." She looked at him for a long time. He watched her face move through something that was working its way from behind the professional surface. From behind the careful, controlled competence that she wore the way he wore his steadiness. And he recognized it because it was the same thing he'd felt when Ethan's tiny fist had curled around his finger in a hospital room 9 years ago and rearranged everything. Something opening that had been closed for a long time. "I have to tell you something," she said. "Okay. I didn't just see a man on a sidewalk that night, I saw—" She stopped, started again. "I grew up watching my father be that man, the man who carried everything and showed nothing, the man who worked until his hands bled and smiled at dinner and never once asked anyone to acknowledge it. He died when I was 19. Heart attack. He was 51 years old and he had been running at full capacity, alone, since before I was born." She paused. "I built everything I have because I wanted to prove that the world he lived in, the one that took everything he gave and gave nothing back, wasn't inevitable. That it was possible to build something where that kind of man was valued the way he deserved to be valued." Michael was very quiet. "When I saw you on that sidewalk," she said, "I saw my father. And I thought—" Her voice was very controlled, but something in it had shifted, had become something that control alone couldn't quite contain. "I thought, I am not going to walk past this." The office was silent for a long time after that. Michael looked at the tattoo on his wrist. He thought about a commanding officer who had looked at him across a metal desk and said, "You're making the right call," and what it had meant to be seen clearly by another person even in the moment of leaving. He thought about his sister placing Ethan in his arms and the weight of him. So small, so absolute, so entirely dependent, and the way that weight had rearranged every priority he had ever held. He thought about a woman in a gray coat stopping on a sidewalk, because she couldn't not stop. "My full name," he said quietly, "is Michael James Rourke. I served with SEAL Team 6 from 2010 to 2019. I was part of 7 classified operations across 4 theaters. 3 of those operations are still classified at levels I'm not at liberty to discuss. I received the Silver Star in 2014 and 2 commendations I'm not authorized to name. I left because my son needed a father more than my country needed another operator, and I have never for one single day regretted that choice." He paused. "I'm telling you this because you told me the real thing, and I think you deserve the real thing back." Maya looked at him across the desk. Her eyes were bright in a way that she wasn't trying to control. "Michael James Rourke," she said. "That's me." She nodded slowly. Then, with the particular directness that was the most distinctly her thing about her, "I'm Maya Ruth Kessler. I grew up in a 2-room apartment in Akron, Ohio. My father was a machinist. My mother left when I was 11. I put myself through college on loans and ROTC, and I built this company from a single delivery van and a client list of 4. I've been alone for most of my adult life, not because I couldn't find people, but because I couldn't find people who didn't eventually want me to be smaller than I am." She paused. "I'm telling you this because you told me the real thing." The city moved outside the window. Inside the office, something had settled. Not resolved, not declared, but settled in the way that true things settle when they've finally been said out loud. It sat between them, like something solid, like something they could both stand on. From the sitting area, Ethan made a small sound in his sleep. Michael turned automatically. Checking, the reflex of a parent always running, never fully offline. The boy shifted, resettled, went quiet again. His sneaker had fallen halfway off. Michael looked back at Maya. She was watching him watch his son. Her expression, in that unguarded moment, was the most honest thing he had seen on a human face in longer than he could remember. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things communicate without words between people who have learned to pay attention to the world rather than perform for it. Both of them had spent their lives paying attention. Both of them were paying attention now. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. Not always dramatic moments. Not always the ones you'd predict. Sometimes it's a question asked late at night in a quiet office. Sometimes it's the answer to that question. Sometimes it's simply two people looking at each other clearly, without armor, without performance, and finding that what they see does not make them want to look away. Michael Rourke had spent his life looking at hard things without flinching. This was the hardest thing he'd looked at in years, and he did not flinch. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Calder Street, 2 blocks from Maya's warehouse, 3 blocks from Ethan's school. It had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a window in the living room that faced east, which meant that on the first morning, November 1st, a Tuesday, gray and cold and extraordinary, Michael stood at that window with a cup of coffee and watched the city come awake in the early light and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He felt like he was home. Ethan had inspected every room the evening before with the methodical thoroughness of a small general taking inventory of new territory. He had opened every cabinet, tested every faucet, determined that the closet in his bedroom was large enough to function as a secret base, and spent 20 minutes arranging a defensive perimeter of shoes around its interior. He had stood at his bedroom window and catalogued the visible section of the street below, with the focused attention of a boy who had learned to pay close attention to the world, because the world did not always stay the same, and you needed to know what you were looking at. Then he had come to find Michael. Where he was sitting on the floor of the empty living room, the furniture would come Saturday, borrowed from Maya's spare storage, which she had offered without ceremony and which Michael had accepted without excessive gratitude. And he had sat down beside him and leaned his head against Michael's arm and said nothing for a long while. "Dad," he said eventually. "Yeah. Is this ours?" Michael put his arm around him. "Yes, buddy, this is ours." Ethan considered that. Then, with the precision of a 6-year-old who had learned to ask the questions that mattered. "For a long time?" "For a long time." Ethan nodded. He seemed to file that away in whatever internal system he used for facts he needed to trust. Then he said, "Saturn has a ring made of ice." "I know," Michael said. "The ice is really old." "How old?" "Millions of years. Maybe more." The book wasn't sure. Michael held his son in the empty room and thought about old ice and the particular permanence of things that had survived a very long time in the cold. And he decided that was a good enough metaphor for where they had arrived. He didn't say that to Ethan. He just sat with it, in the quiet of the new apartment, in the first warmth they'd had in a long time. Gerald Harmon made his final move on a Thursday. Michael had been expecting it, not in its specific form, but in its general shape, in the way that trained men anticipate pressure before it arrives by reading the conditions that precede it. Harmon had been quiet for 2 weeks, which was not the quiet of a man who had given up. It was the quiet of a man who was assembling something. And what he had assembled, it turned out, was a meeting, not with Michael, with the city. A zoning review, technically routine, technically procedural, in practice designed to create enough bureaucratic friction around Maya's warehouse lease to make the next year of her operation a sustained exercise in administrative combat. Harmon had relationships with 2 members of the review board and 1 city council member who had received significant donations from Harmon's holding company in the last election cycle. The review had been quietly expedited, the date set. Maya's attorney had called her on a Wednesday afternoon and explained, in the measured tones of a man delivering news he'd hoped not to deliver, that the review was set for the following Thursday, and that the standard process had been bypassed in a way that was technically legal and practically difficult to contest. Maya had told Michael that evening. She had told him the way she told him things now, directly, fully, without the careful information rationing that characterized how she communicated with almost everyone else in her professional life. That had become, without either of them formally declaring it, the way things worked between them. Full information, no performance. He had listened. Then he had said, "What do you need?" "I need someone to go to that meeting who knows how to read a room under pressure and doesn't rattle," she said. "My attorney will handle the legal arguments. I need someone beside me who won't flinch when Harmon's people try to make this feel bigger than it is." Michael looked at her. "I'll be there." What happened at that meeting was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make things dramatic. There were no raised voices. There was no confrontation that anyone watching would have identified as the turning point. There were 3 members of a city zoning review board sitting behind a long table. 2 attorneys, Maya, Michael, and across the room, Gerald Harmon and 2 members of his legal team. Harmon had looked at Michael when he entered with an expression that contained something between irritation and something colder. Michael had met his eyes, nodded once, not a greeting exactly, but an acknowledgement. The kind that says, "I see you and I am not impressed," and taken his seat beside Maya. The meeting proceeded. Maya's attorney made the legal arguments with precision and thoroughness. Maya spoke twice, both times with the controlled clarity of a woman who had been making arguments in rooms full of skeptical men since she was 23 years old, and had gotten very good at it. Michael sat still and watched the room with the unhurried attention of a man who had been trained to read environments, to identify where the pressure was actually coming from, to notice what people were doing with their eyes and their hands, and the small adjustments of posture that told you more about what someone was thinking than anything they said. And at the moment when Harmon's attorney introduced a supplementary document, a manufactured one, Michael was almost certain, a timeline discrepancy that was designed to cast doubt on Maya's lease documentation, Michael leaned forward slightly. He said, "I'd like to ask where that document originated." The attorney looked at him. "Recalibrated. This is a standard." "I understand what it's presented as," Michael said in the quiet, level tone that had once been used in rooms where the consequences of being wrong were measured in ways that had nothing to do with zoning. "I'm asking where it originated. The date stamp on the header is inconsistent with the filing date visible in the lower margin. If this is a standard document, that inconsistency should be easy to explain." The room was very quiet. The review board member in the center looked at the document, then at Harmon's attorney, then back at the document. What followed was not a dramatic collapse. It was a recalibration, a shift in the room's balance of power that happened quietly. Through the slow accumulation of Harmon's attorney's inability to answer the question cleanly, through the board member's request for verification, through the 15-minute recess that followed, and from which Harmon's team returned visibly diminished. The document was withdrawn. The supplementary arguments built around it collapsed with it. The review concluded with a finding in Maya's favor, not effusively, not apologetically, but clearly and without qualification. Harmon left without speaking to either of them. Michael watched him go. Outside afterward, standing on the steps of the municipal building in the gray November air, Maya had stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Then she had said quietly, "How did you see that? The date stamp?" "Because I was looking for it," he said. "Men like Harmon always overreach. They're too accustomed to rooms where no one pushes back. When someone does, they improvise, and improvised documents have tells." He paused. "I've spent a long time learning to read tells." She had looked at him then. Not the professional assessment she usually gave him. Not the controlled directness she brought to every difficult conversation. Something that had been building for 5 weeks, and that both of them had been careful about, and deliberate about, and that in this moment, on these steps, in this gray air, was simply present and available and no longer requiring management. She reached out and put her hand in his. Not with any particular drama, not with any statement. Just that, her hand in his, on the steps of the municipal building, with the city moving around them the way it always moved, indifferent and continuous. Michael looked down at their hands. He looked at her. He closed his fingers around hers. Ethan was at school. He would be at the corner at 3:15 as always, waiting for his father with the quiet confidence of a child who had learned that his father's word was absolute. Michael would be there. He was always there. But here, for a moment on these steps, Michael Rourke stood still. He stood still the way he had stood still on a cold sidewalk on Meridian Avenue, while a powerful man said the word blight, and the city watched, and the night held its breath. He stood still the way he had stood still through 3 years of invisible work and silent endurance, and the daily heroism that no one writes about and no one applauds. The heroism of the ordinary man who keeps showing up, who keeps his word, who holds his son in the cold and smiles before the boy opens his eyes. He stood still and he let himself feel it. All of it. The long road of it. The cost of it. The particular satisfaction of having carried something heavy over a long distance and arriving somewhere real. Maya's hand was warm in his. The city moved around them. That evening, Michael made dinner in the apartment on Calder Street. Pasta, simple, from ingredients that had been in the cabinet when they moved in, and that felt like a small miracle every time he opened the door and found them there. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and drew a picture with the concentration he brought to everything. A detailed rendering of Saturn and its moons. Labeled carefully, each moon given a name that he had apparently assigned independently of the astronomical record. "That moon's name is Gerald," Ethan said, pointing to a small circle at the outer edge of his drawing. "Which one is Gerald?" "The one that's far away from everyone else." He considered his drawing. He wanted to be closer to Saturn, but he kept doing things wrong, so Saturn made him stay far away. Michael looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he said, "That seems fair." Ethan nodded gravely. "Saturn is the one who decides." Maya arrived at 7. She had not been formally invited. She had texted to ask if she could bring dessert. And Michael had said yes, and she had brought apple pie from the bakery on Calder Street and a picture book about space that she'd found at the bookstore 2 blocks over, which she gave to Ethan with the simple directness she brought to everything. And Ethan had received it with equal simplicity and immediately begun reading it at the table with the pie in one hand and the book in the other. Michael and Maya sat at the kitchen table after dinner while Ethan read, the apartment warm around them, the window showing the city's nighttime glow, and they talked about nothing in particular for a long time. The small specific things that people talk about when they are learning the ordinary shape of each other's lives. The texture of daily existence, the 10,000 minor details that constitute a person's actual life, as opposed to the version of it that's legible from a distance. Michael talked about Ethan's dinosaur names. Maya talked about the delivery van she'd driven herself for the first year of the company, the routes she'd memorized, the clients who had doubled their orders because she'd shown up in person and on time every single time without exception. Michael talked about the bus bench where he'd sat for 30 minutes doing math after the warehouse job ended. Maya talked about the apartment in Akron where she'd grown up, the window she'd looked out at the city from as a girl, the decision she'd made at 14 that the city would not be something she watched from a window but something she moved through on her own terms. They talked until Ethan fell asleep at the table with his cheek on the spacebook and had to be carried to bed. And Michael did that. Lifted him the way he'd lifted him 1,000 times, the boy's weight familiar and specific and beloved. And when he came back, Maya was washing the dishes with the unceremonious competence of someone who didn't perform domesticity, but simply participated in it. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her. She turned and saw him. Neither of them said anything. He crossed the kitchen. He stood beside her at the sink and picked up a dish towel. She handed him a plate. He dried it. She handed him another. They stood side by side at the kitchen sink of the apartment on Calder Street and did the dishes together. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And it was the most important thing that had happened to Michael James Rourke in longer than he knew how to say. When they were done, she leaned slightly against his arm. Not much. Just that. He did not move away. Outside, the city continued. It moved the way it always moved, without acknowledgement, without apology, carrying its 10,000 stories forward without knowing or caring what any of them contained. Somewhere across town, in an office or a car or a house that cost more than most people would earn in a decade, Gerald Harmon was already planning his next approach to the world, already recalculating, already identifying the next pressure point. That was the nature of men like Harmon. They did not stop, but neither did men like Michael. That had always been the difference. Not money, not power, not the particular language of influence that Harmon and his kind spoke with such fluency. The difference was that Michael Rourke had never once, in 35 years and 9 of the most difficult the country had to offer, confused the value of a thing with its price. He knew what was valuable. He knew it the way he knew the weight of his son asleep in the next room, the way he knew the particular quality of warmth coming through the kitchen window of an apartment that was, for the first time, genuinely his. The way he knew the feeling of a woman leaning against his arm in the specific manner of someone who is not performing ease, but actually feeling it. These were the things that cost nothing to buy because they could not be bought. These were the things that men like Harmon could never reach. Ethan slept in his room surrounded by drawings of dinosaurs and moons with improvised names, one hand flung out as always, finding in sleep the same certainty he carried awake. The certainty that his father was close, that his father's word held, that whatever the world sent at them they would face it together and they would not break. And in the kitchen of the apartment on Calder Street, Michael Rourke stood at the window and watched the city's lights and felt, beneath the quiet of the evening, the deep running current of something that had no single name but that contained, in its fullness, everything that mattered. Honor, and the life that honor makes possible. Legacy, and the boy who would carry it forward without knowing yet how much had been spent to give it to him. Love, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that arrives in the shape of a woman stopping on a sidewalk she'd been about to walk past, the kind that grows in the space between two people who have both learned the hard way that the real things in life are quiet and permanent and worth every cost. He had been invisible for a long time. He was visible now. And in the morning, as he did every morning, he would be upright before his son opened his eyes. He would be facing the day. He would be ready. That was what good men did. That was what they had always done. That was what no one would ever take from him. Some stories end with noise, with the satisfying crash of justice delivered publicly, with the kind of reversal that crowds applaud and headlines record. This one ended quietly. It ended in a kitchen. It ended with a sleeping boy in a warm apartment and 2 people standing side by side who had both been carrying more than they should have had to carry alone, and who had, against all probability, found each other. Michael James Rourke had spent 9 years serving his country in silence. He had spent 3 years serving his son in silence. He had never asked for recognition. He had never needed it. But he had deserved it, and on a cold sidewalk on Meridian Avenue, in the November dark, with the city moving past without looking, someone had looked. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.